you don't give a formal setting, to music. Everything is based on improvisation. Everything is based on an informality. Although there is musical concerts and things like that in India, but traditionally, Indian music doesn't necessarily have, always a formal setting. It's something that is very, 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 very informal. And I think that E.M. Foster, he grasped it very well, and that's the setting that he gives, in Passage to India. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. Any other comments? Is there anything you learned about Einstein from this? From the video. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, poetry, and actually, Nitin says that he hated anything that was creative. He was, again, it's Western objective science, and that's why he did not like quantum physics. He did not like quantum mechanics. Later when the Big Bang Theory was espoused, and it actually proved his theory of relativity, but he didn't believe it. He didn't like it, because he liked in a universe that is stable and steady. Suddenly, even the Big Bang, you have a sudden interruption into everything, a beginning and a bang. So he really didn't believe in it, even though it kind of confirmed his theory, but he didn't believe it because he believed that it goes against the grammar of the universe. He liked everything, an eternal universe, which is always there, more or less the same, Although he doesn't talk about the steady state theory, but that's the kind of a view, that he has, that the universe, from all eternity past was more or less, more or less the same, a predictable universe. But quantum physics, when it talks about subatomic particles, it talks about, that you cannot really predict, the movement of the electrons or the neutrons, on a cosmic level. Maybe you can predict somewhat the nature of the laws of nature, but when you come to quantum physics or quantum mechanics, it's very unpredictable. It's very uncertain, and he didn't like that. Whereas Indian music and a lot of Asian music would be very, it would be very unpredictable. So the principle of uncertainty, which Heisenberg, and of course he says he didn't like Heisenberg. Heisenberg came up with this unpredictable uncertainty principle in 1927, and Einstein didn't like it. He did not like Beethoven, because for him Beethoven, even though, even Beethoven has, like all Western music, you would have musical sheet in front of you, and you have to base your music on the sheet in front of you, and even rearranged music, has a sheet of paper in front of you. Indian music is there are no sheets. There are no, what would you say? Yeah, there are no set pieces. Everything is based on improvisation. Something like Western jazz. But in Eastern music, everything, or in Indian music, everything is, it comes from an oral tradition, and it is based on improvisation. So therefore, any song, Indian song, that is sung again would be totally different. So it's not just rearranged. It would be completely different. So it's based on, the whole idea that the universe is a mystery, There's a lot of unpredictability in our lives. There is a lot of uncertainty in our lives. And of course, chance has its play. From a human viewpoint, from a divine viewpoint, we could say that there are no coincidences. Everything is, everything is ordained. But from a human viewpoint, a lot of things happen, what you would say, from a human viewpoint, accidentally. Even a lot of theological, happens accidentally. Even talking to, Sir Chris, he sometimes tells, we had discussions going back, 10, 15 years ago, and then he says, I remember you saying, you're saying this, and I had completely forgotten it, but he still remembers it. But that is, in a sense, from a human viewpoint, accidental. It was not an intentional classroom setting. Where I'm trying to intentionally, trying to, teach. So I'm an Indian, so therefore, I know some of you wanted a more structured, hey, I'm Asian, I'm Indian, so that's the way, so there is no real, structured beginning, middle, and end. That's Western music. In Indian music, you don't have it, so I think that's, that's a difference that comes about here. But I also did not know that he was a violinist, that he was, that he was the vice president of the, the Princeton Symphonic Orchestra. So he knew violin since the age of, 5. Yeah, so I also learned, some things about Einstein. And I had already known, that Einstein and Tagore had met in 1930, and that they had already discussed a lot of things. I have a book of their dialogues, between the two. And again, like he said, on almost every conceivable topic, they discussed. But this musical thing, I also did not know. The music, the way they discussed music. Any other issues that is raised by the video?
Question: how did this unrequited love thing affect Tagore's thinking?
Yeah, I think that's a real tragic period in their life. As you know that, this girl, who got married to the brother, to Tagore's brother, she really liked Tagore. But Tagore was not yet married. And then when Tagore got married, 2 months after he gets married, she committed suicide. And Tagore, there's a lot of tragic element in his poetry. There's a lot of beauty in his poetry, but there's also a tragic element in his poetry, especially after the death of his, sister-in-law. You find there's a change in it. And, I think the statement that Nitin says, that I keep stringing and unstringing my guitar, and the song that I came to sing remain unsung. I think he felt that. I think he felt that none of his poetry actually reached, the agony that he is going through. So he talks about, stringing and unstringing his guitar without actually, but the song that he really wanted to sing, that is unsung, which is kind of strange because he has written 2,000 songs, which is still sung all over India and even many other countries, in the world. They sing. And but the thing I did not know is what Nitin says, that he was also influenced by Celtic, folk songs. That is kind of news, So here again, East meets West. Tagore himself tells, that he is the product of three traditions, British, Islamic, and Hindu. So it was an open kind of a setting, which you find in a lot of Indian families, because India, as you know, as I said last time, we talk about heterogeneity, but I didn't say that India is really the land of heterogeneity, heterodoxy, because you have so many different, viewpoints, philosophies, culture, languages, and so on. So you find it in the fact that he was able to learn that he was able to learn from Celtic music. Now, Tagore was also a painter. He also wrote short stories. He also wrote dramas. He wrote novels. And a lot of his short stories and novels and dramas were actually made into movies by Satyajit Ray. Satyajit Ray was the second Asian to win the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Oscars. And he comes from the same, Satyajit Ray, Rabindranath Tagore, and Nitin all come from what is called Bengal. And he does talk about the Bengali Renaissance. And of course, he won the Nobel Prize for literature. But one thing that is not mentioned in the video is that Tagore, he was influenced by a group of beggars. There is a group of beggars called the Bauls. B as in boy, BAULS. By the way, the United Nations have called these beggars as one of the intangible heritage of humanity. And these are, they are illiterate people, uneducated people. These are beggars. They go around begging, but they come up with compositions, original compositions. And today it's become a little sophisticated. I think they have CDs. There is one Baul who is based in Australia. And so now he is letting out CDs. You can have it you can check it out in YouTube. One American who heard it, she said, that when I first heard it, it seemed like my inside was outside of my body. It was such an emotional, experience. And they sing about nature, they sing about humanity, they sing about divinity, and all original songs that is composed. And these are poets. These are poets. So they go around, and of course people give them money. They're beggars. But the people who give them money never think that they're doing them a favor. Actually, the people who listen feel that they're getting more than what they're giving. Whatever is given, they would accept. But this is a tribe. It's a whole tribe, uneducated people, illiterate people, who go around singing about nature, original songs, poetry set to music, and that influenced Rabindranath Tagore. So here is a man who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, influenced by beggars, uneducated, illiterate, beggars. So, when you think of music and things like, you're not always thinking of the elite, it can come from anywhere, music. So there are a lot of folk traditions, in India, because you have classical music, you also have folk music, you also have modern music with Indian beats, but you also have fusion music, between things that is Indian and West, but the beats are still Indian. So the harmony may be Western, but the melody is still, Indian. So even fusion music, has that. Any other comments?
you can mention the striking similarity between Tagore's music and Islamic chanting.
Yeah, okay, yeah, yes, yeah. That's right. In India, you have what is called the Sufi music. No, it's not just in India, Sufis, very musical. Sufi is my favorite Islamic, school, the Sufis believe that you come in touch with divinity through music and through dance and through poetry. And so one form of the Sufi music is what takes place in what is called the whirling dervishes. You have it in Turkey and and Persia and some places where they go, round and round, almost spinning like a top. And so you come to a point where you feel that you are united to that which is divine. So in India, which has about 170 million Muslims, many people don't know this, that India has the second or third largest Muslim population in the world. There's a debate whether it's Pakistan or India that is the second largest. The largest, of course, is Indonesia, which has about 200 million Muslims. But maybe we could say that India and Pakistan, as you know, is a Muslim country, but India and Pakistan have almost the same, the same number of Muslims. Some say India has more, some says Pakistan has more. It really doesn't matter. But India has about 170 million Muslims and Sufism. So even if you watch Bollywood movies, you would find that a lot of the music is actually Islamic music. In India, you have 5 kinds of Islamic music, and it's mainstream. I mean, you can hear it all over the place. So if you watch a Bollywood movie, you can hear Islamic chanting, Islamic music, Islamic poetry. A lot of the Bollywood poets are Islamic. The top 3 Bollywood actors are Muslims. The best tabla player, which is the classical, percussion instrument, is a Muslim. The one who wrote the music for Slumdog Millionaire, the Indian, who won 2 Oscars and almost every award, the Golden Globe, the BAFTAs, he won, so he won the 2. He is a Muslim, Indian Muslim, an Indian Sufi Muslim. He actually converted to Islam. He was a Hindu who got converted, to Islam. So you'd find, but of course, even though he's a Muslim, when he's doing movies, he has to know all kinds of music, Hindu music, because there are some scenes that are Hindu, so you have to come up with that, but you also come up with Islamic music, but when he, so he was the one, so it was an Indian Muslim who won the Oscars, but nobody usually talks about it that way. If a Muslim throws a bomb, immediately they would say Islamic terrorist. But if in Islam, does it music and things like, nobody would say he's a Muslim, he's a Muslim musician. But if he throws a bomb, Islamic terrorist. But yeah, so since Tagore he himself mentions that there were 3 major influences, which is Islamic, Hindu, and British. So in his whole house, was filled with that. So I think, yeah, right. So you would find Islamic music, Hindu music, Western music like Celtic, Celtic music, and he does talk about that. Now Indian music, is multiple scales. Western music, you have major and minor scales, but in Indian music, it's multiple scale, so it's a lot more complex. So it was said, the melody and the rhythm is more complex. The raga There's no exact word for raga in Western, musical, So he says that it is a series of notes. And you have a raga for the time of the day, So for morning, you have a morning raga. Actually, the raga that, Nikki Wells, the British girl, sang, the Indian raga, that's actually a morning raga. So you have one for morning, you have one for, for noon, one for evening, one for late night. You would have each of it. And for different colors, you would have different ragas. For different seasons, you would have different, ragas. For rain, you have a different raga. And from the different raga, you would come up with different kinds of music. And so you don't have that in Western music. And that's why people who are not used to Indian music, they would find it very exotic. So it needs a kind of a musical ear. You need to be able to learn about it. So those who know, in fact, in another of his videos, Nitin says that he was trying to, make Western classical musicians understand the Indian beat and the Indian rhythm, and he found it difficult because they did not really know. They did not really know it. So multiple scale, whereas in the West it's basically major and minor scale, and then in Indian music you have microtone. So between do and re, do, re, mi, between do and re, you have different, different tonal quality. So this makes it a lot more, what you would say, a lot more complex in the way you understand Indian music. And so there was an American musician named Sam Camden. He is a famous Hollywood, he has come up with scores for Hollywood movies. So he came to India. He wanted to do a collaboration between India, between India and the West. And so he came up, he learned about Indian classical music under a classical musician, and he said that his whole musical life has been changed. He would never look at music the same way anymore. And so so as demonstration, there was one Indian lady who came up with a raga, and he says the first time he heard her, he said it seemed like a 95 voice orchestra, just one lady. It's because of the micro, it's because of the multiple scales, and the microtone. So this brings me to a point I want to make about doing theology. That is, if you only know the lower, then the higher will not make sense. I remember when I was first listening to Indian music. By the way, I grew up listening to Western music. I had an uncle who was into Western classical music, and when he talks about it, he talks about it with a passion. When I used to visit Kerala, which is that's my mother tongue. My parents are both from Kerala, which is a southwest province, and we used to stay with many of our uncles, but there was one uncle, every night was a party. There used to be music going up to, from 8 in the evening to 2 in the morning. And there used to be always for juice every 30 minutes, 1 hour for kids. And there used to be dancing and things like that. But I remember he had about 3,000 vinyl records, the old one. He had 3,000 of it. But as far as I remember, there was not one Indian vinyl record. Of course, we were Christians, so sometimes Christians, I think the most westernized group in India are the Indian Christians, which is, sometimes, can be unfortunate. So, so I grew up like that, listening to Western, music, the Beatles, Cliff Richard, ABBA, and things like that. It's only recently, in the last few years, that I've really, taken to trying to understand, Indian music. And my wife, she has a basic background for music, including even Western music. She has a basic background about it, and she knows, she can discuss about certain tonal qualities and things like that. But when when we were first listening to some songs, she was saying, "Oh, he's Sintanado." Yeah, that guy is actually one of the most famous Indian singers. He's a professional singer. And she said Sintanado because she did not know. Because if you know only the lower, you will not be able to understand that which is higher. And so therefore I want to suggest an essay by C.S. Lewis, called Transposition. And I have already talked to, Professor Chris, and I think he'll try to put it on, Moodle. But you can also check it out in, I think it's there on the internet, PDF, Transposition, where Lewis says that, if you only know the lower, then you will not understand, the higher. That which is higher can understand the lower, but that which is only lower, would not be able to understand the higher. So if you have a completely only naturalistic viewpoint, then you would not be able to understand that which is beyond you. Interestingly, Lewis writes the essay because of Pentecostal Sunday. So he starts with the phenomena, speaking in tongues, but he gives it a very interesting twist. He looks at it from a philosophical and from a philological, to use, the phrase by Chris, but also, looking at it from a linguistic viewpoint. And the basic thing he says is, if you only know the lower, you would not be able to know, the higher. And so, Lewis gives the example in that article, in which he says, imagine that, a woman gives birth to a child inside a cave. They are inside the cave, and let's say they are trapped into the cave, and in the cave, she gives birth to a child, to a baby. And then she has been outside of the cave. For some reason, now she's inside the cave. But the child is only inside the cave. He doesn't know, the outside world. So she is trying to explain to him as best as she can about the outside world. The only thing, her only possession is a paper or canvas and some colored pencils, and some pencils. So she's saying, in the outer world it's like this, and so she is drawing lines, and so on, trying to explain the outside world, and the child is trying to understand as best as he can, the outside world that his mother is trying to explain. And then suddenly, after a while, the mother suddenly says, but in the outside world there are no lines. So the world that he was learning suddenly crumbles. He says, what? There are no lines in the real world? And then, so for him, the real authentic thing was the lines by which he was trying to imagine. But he says, so as long as she said there's no lines like this in the real world, he could not even figure out, because, she was trying to paint in two-dimensional, the three-dimensional world. And so he could not fully understand. And so she had to tell him the reason that there are no lines in the real world, because it is much more real. But for him, for the child, precisely because there are no lines, for the child, it meant that it is something that is vague. Because the only way he's trying to understand the real world is through lines. So because there is no lines, it's vague. But for the mother, because it is so rich and so colorful, it's three-dimensional, that's why there is no lines. And so Lewis makes the point, that's what it means, transposition. You can transpose the spirit to the material. But if you only have a materialistic worldview or a naturalistic worldview, all phenomena, like what the Holy Spirit's, coming into people's lives and trying to take over people's lives, and people's experience of the Holy Spirit would all appear as nonsense if you only know the lower. So if you only think that matter, the material world, and nature is all that exists, then the higher world of the spiritual would make no sense. And that's what the article is, transposition. And I don't want to talk more about the article because I want you guys to read it. And it's only a few pages. But like everything that he has written, Lewis has never written anything that is not interesting. There are things that I don't agree with some of the things that he says, but everything that he writes makes you think. And so I would ask you to, check it out. And so that's why, so when my wife first heard it, and Indian music, she said it's, Sintanado. When I sing, I'm always Sintanado, Saintanado. We had a musical group in the church, not me, I was not part of it, but we called it the Saintanados. Where And so let me give you, the Filipinos among you would know about Jim Paredes, right? Of the Apo Hiking Society. Jim Paredes is a very good musician, but when he went to Saudi Arabia to perform a concert, of course most of the people who attended the concert were Filipinos, and so they had never really heard a live concert of Filipinos coming and singing, so they were really touched, and Jim Paredes in one of the interviews was saying, that they were really touched, the Filipinos were crying, and then he made a statement. He said, because in Arab, among the Arabs, there is no such thing as Arabic music. I almost fell off my chair, He said there is no such thing as Arabic music, As I just said, Islamic music in India alone, there are 5 kinds of Islamic music that is mainstream. Of course, with a lot of Indian influence, and so on. Now that's Jim Paredes. There's another Filipino singer, Basil Valdez. So Basil Valdez went to, he went to one of the Arab countries, and he learned one Arab, an Arab melody, and then he went to Ryan Kayabyab, who's one of maybe the most famous pianist and composer in the Philippines. So he went to Ryan Kayabyab and he said, I learned Arab, song. I will hum it, and can you play it in the piano? And he said, okay. And so Basil Valdez, was humming the Arab song. But Ryan Kayabyab couldn't play it. So Ryan Kayabyab said, it's in between the keys. In between each keys in the keyboard. That's what I mean by, although, so that's another example of, multiple scales and microtone. And he couldn't play it. Because it's what you would say, multiple scale. Although Indian music, because of its diversity, would have more. But it's not just India, there are other places. But India would be maybe the most famous example of having multiple scales and, and microtone. When you look at, many of you would know about Sarah Brightman, right? Sarah Brightman is one of the most famous, crossover singers, Botticelli, Josh Groban and others who try to bridge between classical and pop, or pop music, so that you could call them crossover artists, But, maybe one of the most famous is Sarah Brightman. So Sarah Brightman comes up with a song in which, she sings in English, and an Arabic singer sings in Arabic. It's a beautiful thing. I think it's there on YouTube. Where she sings it the Western way, and he sings it, the Arabic music, and it's beautifully blended together. And actually, he holds his own against Sarah Brightman. In fact, I like his parts even better, even though I like Sarah Brightman a lot. But in that particular song, I like the Arab singer's, part better than even Sarah Brightman's, part. So so when you learn music, especially indigenous music, whether it's Africa or whether it's India or whether it's Arabic, you're learning, in a sense, a new language, a musical language. So even though we use the phrase, music knows no language, and there is a lot of truth to it, in the sense that music can really touch us, touch our whole personality, not just the intellect, like sometimes what philosophy does. But whereas music, like any art, touches the whole person. So I don't know how many of you watched the movie Ali, by what's his name, Will Smith. I think it's Will Smith, right? Ali. So the movie ends with Ali fighting George Foreman, I think it's in Zaire, or one of the African countries. That's what, of course, the thriller in Manila was not included, there, which is would have been interesting for us, here in the Philippines. But, Ali Mall is named after, Muhammad Ali, where he came to fight. As you know, Ali came before Joe Frazier to the Philippines. He came a few days or a week earlier than Joe Frazier. So one reporter, asked him that, how come you came before Joe Frazier? And so Ali said, I came before Joe Frazier so that the Filipinos will not think that all blacks are ugly. He really said that, See, go up and see, Muhammad Ali, right? I mean, even though he was black. But the reason I'm telling you the story is, about the movie Ali is the last part. As they're going into Africa, the last part is an African music. It's just beautiful. It's really, touching. Now, there are other music, including Western music, in some parts of the movie, but nothing compared, to the African, the African music, the African drums, the African syncopation. You see that, And so today you would find in a lot of Hollywood movies, African drums and Indian music in the background, and sometimes Chinese, music and so on, So when you learn even a simple thing like, like music, there's a whole philosophy behind a music. And I think, and there's almost a different language, musical language. So while it's true to say that music knows no language, in one sense that's true, but in another sense, we need to be able to appreciate the diversity. And when you learn a music, when you go deep into the music, you would find that. So there is, even food, there's a philosophical depth, with food, the way it's cooked, the way it brings people together. And some cultures, they more explicitly talk about the philosophy behind, eating and things like that, like Japanese culture, they have a whole philosophy behind it. In India also, you have a whole philosophy behind it. But every country, every culture has it. Sometimes it's implicit, sometimes it's explicit. But every culture has it, But that's a true in even regarding music. And so I think it's kind of an interesting thing. Later, if we still have some time, we'll look at another of it. If not, we'll look at it some other time. Another TED talk by him, because music becomes important as Christians and for worship. So let's take a break and then we'll come back and look at the Holy Spirit or even music.